Chapter 9. The evening before Christmas Eve, Olav was sent for to the bishop. A candle was burning on the reading desk in the deep window. The little stone-walled chamber looked cosy and comfortable in its faint light. There was no other furniture but a chest for books and a bench against the walls. The bishop slept and ate there. He used neither bed nor table. But there was a low stool on which his secretary could sit with his writing board in his lap when the bishop dictated letters to him. At other times, when Olav had been up, the Lord Thorfinn had bidden him sit on the stool, and Olav had liked to crouch at the bishop's knee. It made it easy to speak to him, as to a father. But this evening Lord Thorfinn came straight up to him and stood with his hands under his scapula. "The Torresons will be here on 12th night, Olav. I have summoned them hither, and they have promised to appear. Now we shall have an end of this matter, with God's help." Olav bowed in silence and looked anxiously at the bishop. Lord Thorfinn pursed his lips and nodded once or twice. "To tell the truth, my son, they show no great mind to be reconciled. They spoke to my men about my having accepted penance of you for your share in the slaughter and suffered you to go to Mass. They would have had me free them also from the ban before Yule. But that is another matter of which we must speak at our meeting. But, you can guess, they are angry that I did not receive you as though you had been a robber and a ravisher." He gave a short, angry laugh. Olav looked at the bishop and waited. "You have done wrong. Never must you think anything else. But you are young and far from your kinsfolk and guardians, and these incendiaries seek to abate the rights of two fatherless children. You will not be downhearted, I trust," he said, giving Olav a little slap on the shoulder, "if you are forced to bow somewhat low to Ingunn's uncles. You know, boy, you have injured them. You shall not have to suffer at their hands if I am able to hinder it." "I shall do as you say, my lord and father," said Olav, a little downcast. The bishop looked at him with a fleeting smile. "You will not like it, having to bow your neck a trifle. No, no. If you are going to church now, you may go by the balcony." Bishop Thorfinn nodded and held out his hand to be kissed, in token that the audience was at an end. The Brothers of the Cross were in the middle of singing Vespers. Olav knelt down in a corner with his fur cloak well spread under his knees and held his cap before his eyes, that he might the better collect his thoughts. He was on the strain, but it was a good thing, nevertheless, that the decision was now at hand. He longed to escape from uncertainty. It had been like walking in the dark upon a road, where at any moment he might stumble and plunge both feet into the mire. That he had feared. Of Kolbein and the rest he was not afraid. An end was to be made of all doubtful and half-concealed conduct. His case was to be brought to a conclusion. He would soon be 17 years old. He liked to feel that he was the chief person in a suit. And he felt as though his bones had hardened within him in these weeks he had lived in the bishop's palace, after all the slothful years at Frettestein among lazy housecarls and cackling women, joining in children's games. His pride in himself had grown with every day he spent here, where there were neither women nor frivolity, but only grown men who had taught him much, and to whom he had taken a liking with all his youthful desire of meeting equals and superiors. It warmed his soul through and through to think that Asbjorn Priest had the greatest use for his help, and that Bishop Thorfinn bent over him with fatherly kindness. When he had finished his prayers, he seated himself in a corner to hear the singing to the end. He thought of what Asbjorn Allfat had told him one day of the art of reckoning, how the nature of God was revealed in figures through the law and order that reigned in them. Arithmetica! He thought it had such a fine sound, and all that the priest had expounded about the harmony of figures, how they swelled and cleft one another according to mystic and immovable laws. It was like being given an insight into one of the heavenly kingdoms. On golden chains of numbers the whole of creation was suspended, and angels and spirits ascended and descended along the links. And his heart was exalted in longing that his life also might rest in God's hands, like one of these golden links, a reckoning in which there was no fault, when that which now weighed upon him should be effaced like false notches upon a tally stick. The midnight mass, the mass of the angels, was more beautiful than anything Olaf had imagined. The whole great body of the church lay in pitch darkness, but in the choir around the high altar so many candles, high and low, were burning that they seemed like a wall of living flame. There was a soft sheen of gold-embroidered silk, and a brightness of white linen. Tonight all the priests wore cantor's vestments of cloth of gold and silk, and the other singers were clad in linen surplices and held candles in their hands as they stood and sang from the great books. Steinfinnsons was among them, and other men of repute from the country round who had been at the school in their youth. The whole church was heavy with the scent of incense from the evening procession, and the grey clouds of perfume still ascended from the altar. When the whole choir of men and boys joined in the great Gloria, it was as though angels took up the song and swelled the music from the gloom of the roof. Bishop Thorfinn's face shone like alabaster as he sat on his throne with mitre and staff in golden vestments. Now all the mass bells pealed out, and now all who had been standing or sitting knelt down, waiting in breathless silence for the transubstantiation, which tonight became one with God's birth in the world of men. Olaf waited in eager longing. His prayers became one with his yearning for righteousness and a good conscience. He had had a glimpse of Ingunn over on the women's side, but he did not go out after Mass when he saw her go. While they were singing the louder in the choir, he found a place to sit on the base of one of the pillars, and there, wrapped in his cloak, he shivered and nodded by turns till the priests left the choir. On the ground outside the graveyard there was still a glow of burnt-out bonfires, where the church-folk had thrown down their torches in a heap as they came in. Olaf went up to warm himself. He was chilled and numb from the many hours in church. The snow was melted far around, down to the bare earth, and the red and black embers still gave out a good strong heat. Many people were standing about. Olaf caught sight of Ingunn. She was standing with her back to him. She was alone. He went up and greeted her. She turned half round, and a reflection of the fire shone red upon the white linen wimple that showed under the hood of her cloak. She still seemed a little strange to him in this woman's dress. He could not grasp the thought that she should go about looking old and dignified, because he, for his part, was determined to win his rights and to be respected as a grown man. They shook hands and wished each other a blessing on the feast. Then they talked a little about the weather. The cold was not too bad, and the sky was half clear with a few stars, but not many, for there was some mist, since the lake was not yet frozen over here. Tora came up to them, and Olaf greeted her with a kiss. He could never bring himself to kiss Ingunn now when they met. She was both too near and too far for him to embrace her as a foster brother. Tora went again at once over to some friends she saw. Ingunn had scarcely spoken, and had looked away the whole time. Olaf thought perhaps he would have to go. It could not look well, there standing here together. Then she put out her hand and timidly took hold of his cloak. "Can you not go with me, so that we may talk?" "Surely I can. Do you take the south road?" The dark street was alive with heavy, fur-clad figures, swaying black against the snow. Folk were going to rest a while in their houses before the mid-morning mass. The drifts were banked high against houses and fences and trees. Walls and branches were but little restless spots of black in the snow. Christmas night lay close and dark upon the little town, and folk moved about silently as scared shadows, hurrying in where a door was opened and a faint light fell upon the snowdrifts in yard and street. But smoke issued from the louvers, and there was a smell of smoke everywhere. The women were putting on the pots for the Christmas meal. Outside Holy Cross Church, a gleam of light fell on the snow from the wide open doors, and some old inmates of the Spittal dragged themselves in. There was to be Mass now. Ingunn and Olav tramped along the narrow alley behind the church. Here they did not meet a soul. It was very dark under the trees and heavy going, as the snow had been little trodden. "We had no thought, when we came here that day last summer, that it would be so difficult for us," said Ingunn with a sigh. "No, we could not know that." "Can you not come in with me?" she asked as they stood in the yard. "The others were going to Holy Cross." "I can, surely." They entered a pitch-dark room, but Ingunn stirred the fire on the hearth and put fresh wood on it. She had taken off her cloak, and as she knelt forward to blow the fire, the long white wimple lay over her shoulders and down to her hips. "Tora and I sleep here," she said with her back to him. "I promised to do this for them." She hung the pot on its hook. Olav guessed that this was the kitchen of the house. Round about were things used in cookery. Ingunn busied herself to and fro in the glare of the fire, tall and slight and young in her dark dress and white coif. It was like a game, something unreal. Olav sat on the edge of the bed and looked on. He did not know what to say, and then he had grown so sleepy. "Can you not help me?" asked Ingunn. She was cutting up meat and bacon on a platter by the hearthstone. There was a piece of back that she could not sever with the knife. Olav found a hatchet, chopped it, and broke it apart. While they were busy with this, she whispered to him as they knelt among the pots. "You are so glum, Olav. Are you unhappy?" As he only shook his head, she whispered yet lower, "It is so long since we were alone together. I thought you would be glad. You know that, surely." "Have you heard that your uncles are coming on 12th night?" he asked. Then it struck him that she might take that for an answer to her question whether he were unhappy. "You need not be afraid," he said firmly. "We shall have no fear of them." Ingunn had risen to her feet and was staring at him as she opened her mouth in a little gasp. Then she made as though she would throw herself into his arms. Olav showed his hands. They were smeared with fat and brine. "Come here. You can wipe them on the bedspread." She moved one of the pots. "We can lie down a little while we wait for it to boil." Olav drew off his boots and unfastened his cloak. When he had lain down by her side, he spread it over them both. The next instant she had him in a close embrace, with her face pressed hotly against his cheek, so that her breath tickled his neck. "Olav, you will not suffer them to take me away with them and part me from you?" "No. They will have no power to do that. But you know that it is no trifling matter Kolbein will claim before he will be reconciled with me."
"Is it for that?" she whispered, clinging to him yet tighter. "Is it for that you are less fond of me now?"
"I am just as fond of you as I ever have been," he muttered thickly, groping to get an arm under her neck, but it was so tangled in the wimple.
"Shall I take it off?" she whispered eagerly.
"No, it will give you trouble to put it on again."
"It will soon be a month since we have scarce seen each other all this time," she complained.
"Ingunn, you know I only wish for your good," he pleaded, and recalled at once that he had said this before. When, he could not remember. "To think she has so little wit," he reflected sadly, "that she cannot see she is tempting me at this moment."
"Ah, yes, but I long so for you. They are kind, these women here, but for all that I long to be with you."
"I know, but it is a holy night, this one. We must go to Mass again in a little while." He turned red with shame in the dark at his own words. Such things should not even be spoken. Quickly he rose in the dark, kissed her eyelids, and felt the eyeballs move and quiver under his mouth, while the tears trickled down and wet his lips.
"Don't be angry," he whispered imploringly.
Then he moved to the foot of the bed and lay with his face to the room, looking at the fire. Tormented by the tumult in his heart and in his blood, he listened for any sign of movement or weeping, but she kept as still as a mouse. At last he heard that she had fallen asleep. Then he stood up, put on his boots, and took his cloak, wrapping her in the bed-cover instead. He was freezing and felt sleepy and giddy and empty from his long fast. The cauldron of meat was boiling and smelt so good that it gave him a pain in his chest. Outside it had turned colder. The snow cried under his feet, and there was more frost in the air. He could see that in spite of the darkness. Folk were beginning slowly to go up to the church again. Olaf shivered a little under his fur cloak. He was so tired that he had no great mind to go to Mass now. He would rather have gone home and slept. And he had looked forward so much to this Christmas night with its 3 services, each more beautiful than the last, they said. In the days that intervened before that of the meeting, Olaf stayed for the most part within the palace, and scarcely went beyond the church. Day after day there were splendid services, and the palace was full of guests for the feast. Both priests and laymen had their hands so full with all kinds of duties that Olaf was left mostly to himself. With the bishop he had only once had speech, when he thanked him for his New Year's gift. Lord Thorfinn had given him a brown cloth kirtle reaching to the feet and bordered with fine black otter skin. It was the first garment Olaf had possessed, which was altogether handsome and fit for one who would pass for a grown young man, and it added not a little to his self-respect that he could now feel perfectly well dressed. For Arnvid had lent him money to buy a handsome winter cloak, lined with marten, with hose, boots, and other things to go with it. From Asbjorn Allfat, Olaf heard that the bishop had now received an answer from the men he had charged to inquire of Olaf's own kinsmen what they thought of the case. The bishop was by no means pleased with their answers. So much was certain, that Steinfinn had never taken over the guardianship of Olaf in a proper binding way. And yet none of the men of the family had asked after the child or claimed his return from Fretterstein. "'Tis no little trouble and expense our reverend father is put to for your sake, Olav," said Asbjorn priest with a little laugh. "Now he has summoned hither these kinsmen of yours from Hvit. It seems he of Hestviken is palsied and in poor case. But the men of Hvit must give consent to your marriage, I think, before it can be lawful. And they let fall to the parish priest, who spoke with them on Lord Thorfinn's behalf, that if the Torresons would have this marriage, then they must offer you the seduced maid, aye, that was their word, not mine, with such dowry as you may be pleased to accept. But they would never consent to your making more amends to her kinsmen than the law allows for fornication. And you know that Kolbein and Ivar cannot accept an atonement on such terms. It would be to their shame as long as they live. I think it would be to my shame and to hers," said Olaf angrily. "It would be the same as if she were a lehman." "Yes, you are right." Therefore the bishop hinted of another way, which might be the last resort, that you leave the country and stay abroad 4 winters, till you be of full age and can parley on your own behalf. Lord Thorfinn thought you could go to Denmark and seek refuge with your mother's kin. You know that in that land your mother's kinsmen are among the mightiest. Your uncle, Barnim Eriksson of Hovdingard, is said to be the richest knight in Sealand. Olaf shook his head. My mother's father was called Bjorn Anderson of Viteberg, and her only brother was Stig. It was in Jutland, I have been told. The Lady Margaret was married twice. Bjorn was her second husband, and first she had a son named Erik Eriksson. He owned Hovdingard in Sealand. Do you think, Olaf, it would be the worst mischance if you had to live some years in foreign lands, and could see something of other folks' manners and customs, and could associate with wealthy and powerful kinsfolk to boot? The priest's words turned Olaf's thoughts in a new direction. Since he came to the bishop's see, he had indeed found out that it was a very small and narrow piece of the world that he knew. These churchmen, they sent letters and messengers north, south, east and west. In less than 6 weeks, they managed to get word from folk whom it would have been impossible for Olaf to reach. They might as well have lived in Iceland or in Rome. And now the bishop knew more of Olaf's own mother's kindred than he himself had ever done. In the church were books and candlesticks from France, silk curtains from Sicily sent hither by a pope, woven tapestries from Arras, relics of martyrs and confessors who had lived in England and Asia. Asbjorn Allfat told him of the great schools in Paris and Bologna, where a man might learn all the arts and wisdom in the world. In Salerno one could learn the Greek tongue and how to become proof against steel or poison. Asbjorn was a farmer's son from the uplands, and the longest journey he had ever made was north to Irebu Church. But he talked very often of travelling in foreign lands, and he would surely be sent abroad in time, for he was an able man and useful in many ways. On most days Olaf spoke to Arnvid Finnsson only when they went to bed at night and when they got up. The friends had become more strangers to one another since they came to the bishop's palace. Arnvid was occupied with so much that Olaf did not understand. And then Arnvid's presence reminded the young man of so many things that were difficult and humiliating. Olaf felt a kind of remorse or shame when he remembered all the things of which Arnvid had been a half-willing, half-reluctant witness, though Olaf himself could not understand how he had been able to compel a man who was so much older than he, a rich and powerful landowner, when one came to think of it. But it was as though he had used force upon his friend in one way or another, both in that matter of the ring and afterwards, when Arnvid held his peace about what he knew of Olaf's nightly visits to his young kinswoman. This last would be judged harshly, not only by the Torreson, but by everyone else. Arnvid had gotten an ugly stain on his honour there, and for that he was too good. And Olaf knew that Arnvid took things greatly to heart. Therefore he was not quite at ease with Arnvid now. With Asbjorn Priest he felt safe and easy. He was always the same, a steady, strenuous worker, whether he was saying his hours or passing salted hides. His long, thin horse's face was just as unmoved, and his voice just as dry and precise, when he was saying his mass, or when he stood by while goods were being weighed, or tested whether it were true that the supports of a cowhouse were rotten on one of the farms of the bishop's estate. Olaf went with him, thinking of his own future. When he came to Hestviken and would go about in his own boats, among his own quays and byres and storehouses, unconsciously it was this friend he dreamt of imitating. The memory of those hours alone with Ingunn on Christmas night had reawakened his longing for her. He thought of the slender, girlish young wife in her woman's dress, on her knees blowing at the embers, moving in and out of the flickering light, and busying herself between the benches and the hearth. Thus he would lie at home in his own bed at Hestviken on dark winter mornings, and look on while Ingunn made a fire on his hearth. He recalled her warm and affectionate embraces when they lay resting in the dark. When they came to Hestviken, they would sleep together in the great bed as master and mistress of the house. Then he would be able to take her in his arms as often as he liked, and every evening he could lie and talk to her of all that had happened to him that day, take counsel with her as to what he should do next. And he would no longer be forced to fear what he had hitherto dreaded as a misfortune. It would only increase their joy and their repute to have children. Then he would no longer be the last slender twig of a dying race. He would himself become the stem of the new tree. Then it was that Asbjorn's words suddenly threw this new, unimagined thought into his mind. He had never thought it might fall to his lot to roam abroad and see the world. Far, far away. France, England, Denmark. They were all one to the boy, who, as long as he could remember clearly, had travelled no longer road than that between Fretterstein and Hamar, had never dreamt of further voyaging than out from Hestviken and back again with his trading craft. He had been willing to accept the fate prepared for him, and had been content with it. But that was before he had had any thought that it might be different. Now, it was as though he had been offered a gift. 4 years to look about him in the world, and try his fortunes, see people and countries, and this just as he found out what a small and out-of-the-way corner of the world they were, these places which he had believed were all he was destined to see. And then there was this other thing, that he was said to come of such great folk on his mother's side. And they told him that now, just as the Steinfinnsons sought to make him a lesser man than they, and when it appeared that his kinsmen on his father's side either did not care or were not strong enough to defend his rights. But in Denmark he need only ride straight to the richest and mightiest knight's castle there was in the land, and say to its master, "I am your sister Cecilia's son." One evening Olaf took out his mother's signet ring and put it on his finger. He might as well wear it himself, till he was reconciled with Ingunn's kinsman. And the little gold cross with the gilt chain he hung about his neck and hid on his breast under the shirt. He had heard his mother brought it with her from her home. Just as well to take good care of those things he had which might serve as tokens in case of need. Come what may, he would not be at a loss, even if his enemies set hidden snares for his feet, and his kinsmen in Norway availed him little. The Steinfinnsons came to Hamar a few days later than they had been summoned. There were Kolbein with both his sons, Ivar Thorisson and a young nephew of the Thorissons, Halvard Erlingsson. Halvard's mother, Ragnar, was full sister to Kolbein. She too was one of old Thor's children by his leman, and Halvard had been but seldom at Fretestein, so Olaf scarcely knew him. But he had heard it said that Halvard was very stupid. Olaf was not allowed to be present at their audience with the bishop. Arnvid said it was because his spokesman had not come, and therefore Olaf could not appear himself. It was not on his behalf that the bishop was acting, but on that of the church, which alone had the right to decide whether a marriage was valid or not. Olaf did not like this, nor did he see the difference clearly. But both Arnvid and Asbjorn Priest had been present at the interview. They said that at first Kolbein and Ivar had been very headstrong. What angered them most was that the Lord Thorfinn had sent Ingunn out of the town, to a farm near Otterstad church. Kolbein said that here in the uplands it had never been the custom to let the Bishop of Hamar rule like a petty king. It was easy to see that the man came from Nidaros, for there the priests did as they pleased in everything. It was surely an unheard-of thing that the bishop should harbour a seduced maid who had run from her kinsman to hide her shame and escape chastisement, or should throw his shield over the ravisher. Bishop Thorfinn answered that so far as he knew, Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter had neither run away nor had been ravished by Olav Audunsson. But Arnvid Finnsson had brought the two young people hither and requested the bishop to search out a matter which came under the jurisdiction of the church, and to retain Olaf and the girl in the meantime. It was the brothers themselves who had asked Arnvid to stay at Fretestein and take charge of the estate and the children. When, therefore, he found out that Olaf had outraged the elder daughter, he had called the man to account for his conduct. Then it came out that these two childish people had fancied that because their fathers had made a bargain about them when they were small, and both Steinfinn and Audun were now dead and gone, they themselves and no one else were now to see that the agreement was kept and the bargain accomplished. Wherefore they had cohabited as a married couple ever since Steinfinn's death, believing that they did no wrong in this. Arnvid had then taken the course of bringing these two to Hamar, in order that learned men might inquire how the case stood. One thing was certain. Since Olaf and Ingunn had given themselves to each other in the belief that they were fulfilling a marriage agreement, neither of them was now free to marry anyone else. Equally certain was it that such a wedding was against the law of the land and the commandments of the church, and the woman had forfeited her right to dowry, inheritance, and support of kinsfolk for herself and her child or children, if it should prove that she had conceived. But from the man her sponsors could claim fines for his infringement of their rights, and both were under an obligation to do penance to the church for not having kept her commandments as to the proclamation of bans and the due celebration of matrimony. But now the bishop bade the woman's uncles remember that Olaf and Ingunn were very childish, ignorant, and unlearned in the law, and that they had grown up in the belief that they were destined to be married. Torbring of Vik, and two good franklins besides, had deposed before him, the bishop, that Steinfinn Thorisson had hanselled his child Ingunn to Audun Ingolfsson as a wife for Audun's son. They would make oath of this on the book. And Arnvid testified that just before his death, Steinfinn had spoken of the agreement to Olaf, and said it was his wish that it should hold good. Therefore he asked Ingunn's kinsman to accept atonement on such terms as might be agreeable to all. That Olaf and Ingunn should fall at the feet of the Torrisons and beg their forgiveness, and that Olav should make amends for his self-willed conduct according to the judgment of impartial men. But, this being done, Bishop Thorfinn thought that it would best become the Torresons if they were reconciled to Olav as good Christians and great-minded men. Let him possess the woman with such dowry that the affinity would bring no shame to themselves, and Olav would suffer no disgrace in his native place for having made a marriage which did not add to his power and fortune. Finally, the bishop bade the brothers bear in mind that it is a good deed and specially pleasing in the eyes of God to care for fatherless children, but that to deprive such of their rights is one of the worst of sins, a sin which cries aloud for vengeance even here on earth, and it was the dead men's wish that their children should be given to one another in marriage. But if it were, as they sought to prove, that Olav and Ingunn had never been affianced in legal wise, and they could not agree with Olav's guardians on the course to adopt, then it was clear that they must bring a suit for fornication against the lad. And in that case the bishop would hand Ingunn over to them, that they might punish her as they thought she deserved, and divide her part of the inheritance among her brothers and sister, and afterwards her kinsmen would have to support her as seemed fit to them. But he himself would cause it to be published in all the bishoprics of Norway that these two were not free to marry any others, so long as both were alive, lest any third party, man or woman, might fall into the sin of adultery by taking a husband or a wife who was already bound in wedlock according to God's ordinances. This last hit the mark, both Arnvid and Asbjorn thought. Neither of the uncles had a mind to receive Ingunn if they were to feed her, and could never get her married off. Kolbein spoke at length to the effect that Olav Audunsson had well known how he and his brother regarded the betrothal, and that they intended to dispose of Ingunn in another way. But he promised at the last that for the bishop's sake he would make atonement with Olav. As to the conditions, however, he would say nothing until all was made plain about the old agreement, and he had made tryst with Ingolf Helgason of Hvit, or whichever of Olav's kinsmen it might be who had authority to act on the boy's behalf. The bishop hinted that so much at least was certain, that sponsalia de futuro had been made at that time at the thing. So if only the Torresons gave their consent to what was already accomplished, Olav could act for himself, and then they would surely find him very compliant. But to this Kolbein gave a flat no. They would not take advantage of the boy's ignorance, but they claimed to deal with Olav's kinsmen, that the case might end in honourable and seemly fashion for them and their kinswoman,